We step into this narrative holding an assumption so commonplace that it seldom seems like an assumption whatsoever. The notion that the contemporary world marks the initial point where humanity genuinely comprehends the planet it inhabits. That solely through satellites, supercomputers, and worldwide data systems have we at last started to perceive how Earth truly functions. But suppose this assurance is misguided. What if we aren't the initial ones to pose these inquiries, but simply the most recent to reach a tale that commenced well before written history? To investigate that potential, we must retreat not by decades or centuries, but by thousands upon thousands of years, sufficiently distant that the hallmarks of current society forfeit their significance. Distant enough that nations, borders, and technologies fade into a momentary spark within profound time. At that range, Earth doesn't shift to the cadence of human existence. It shifts to more gradual, chillier, and much more enduring cycles. Cycles that develop across durations so extensive that one lifetime can't completely perceive them, yet potent enough to determine the destiny of whole societies. Nowadays, we articulate these patterns using exact terminology. Orbital cycles, climate fluctuations, magnetic flips, solar cadences, and lunar tides. The terms appear impartial, even aloof. But throughout much of human history, these forces weren't mere concepts. They were felt firsthand via ruined crops, encroaching ice, receding coastlines, and heavens that ceased to act as recollection indicated they ought to. And what emerges prominently is not that early peoples misinterpreted these alterations, but that numerous communities seem to have structured their existence around foreseeing them. Picture a realm lacking electricity, lacking international commerce, lacking enormous stockpiles of preserved sustenance. In that realm, ecological steadiness isn't a luxury. It is endurance when the climate alters. Breakdown isn't hypothetical. It is instant under such circumstances. Observing the heavens isn't ceremony. It is tactic. Recalling configurations of wind, water, and warmth isn't folklore. It is a repository transmitted across generations, inscribed in narratives, emblems, and structures, resilient enough to surpass personal lifetimes. Before proceeding further, if it strikes you, share in the comments how you're tuning in at this moment. Some folks are easing into slumber, some are relaxing, some are merely allowing the narrative to unfold in the backdrop. I consistently find it fascinating how these concepts encounter individuals in varied instances. And as a subdued reminder, the visuals displayed here are intended solely to contribute ambiance and setting. The narrative endures even absent them. As ever, thank you for your presence and for backing this expedition. This poses a disquieting potential. What if numerous myths we reject nowadays aren't fabrications, but condensed recollections of cycles too prolonged for one human lifespan to observe entirely? What if accounts of golden eras, immense deluges, perpetual winters, and flaming heavens weren't imaginings, but storytelling devices crafted to safeguard data when script was scarce and vulnerable? If that's the case, then early civilizations might not have existed in unawareness of Earth's cadences, but in ongoing dialogue with them. What renders this concept uneasy is what it suggests regarding us. If societies prior to ours grasped these cycles and nonetheless crumbled, then insight by itself was never sufficient. If they synchronized their communities with the planet's cadences and were nevertheless overrun, then what precisely safeguards us now? Our technology provides us extent and velocity, but it doesn't bestow exemption from forces functioning on planetary durations. Contemporary history is frequently narrated as a direct path from rudimentary to sophisticated, from bewilderment to lucidity, from susceptibility to mastery. Yet Earth doesn't advance in direct paths. It advances in circuits, cycles that intersect, bolster, and occasionally clash, attaining points where equilibrium yields and frameworks reboot. In this perspective, civilizations aren't enduring accomplishments, but provisional setups that persist amid calmer pauses between much vaster cadences. One of the subtler insights arising from current science is that the planet's most notable transformations seldom occur without forewarning. They declare themselves gradually via minor deviations, faint adjustments, indicators too faint to overpower one lifetime, but evident when examined over millennia. If early communities monitored these indicators, then they might have comprehended something challenging for us to sense today: the magnitude of time itself. Maybe their primary inquiry was never how to subdue nature, but how to stay aligned with it as long as feasible. That distinction is significant because one route results in boundless expansion, while the other results in voluntary moderation. And history indicates that communities founded on moderation leave fewer conspicuous structures. They leave voids, quietudes, and unresolved queries. It is amid those voids that we currently position ourselves, encircled by data, technology, and a potent feeling of command, yet progressively detached from the extended cadences of the planet under us. We can predict tomorrow's weather with remarkable precision, but find it hard to envision the forthcoming 1,000 years. We react swiftly to immediate crises, while staying unsure about the gradual merging cycles that form the profounder future. This narrative doesn't contend that early civilizations held flawless solutions, nor does it idealize the past. Rather, it inquires if a manner of perceiving the world once prevailed that positioned cycles instead of steadiness at the core. A viewpoint that might have been forfeited when humanity started to think it had evaded the planet's most fundamental restrictions. If that viewpoint once directed human communities, then the inquiry is no longer if we comprehend Earth's cycles, but if we are heeding them appropriately. Because it's conceivable that prior civilizations didn't vanish due to ignorance, but because even consciousness couldn't always surmount the instant when various cycles converged. If that's accurate, then we aren't positioned at this story's commencement, but someplace close to the conclusion of a known circuit, where ancient indicators are reappearing in fresh shapes, where long overlooked patterns are silently reimposing themselves in a world much more populated and delicate than previously. From this point, we won't start with data or catastrophe, but with the heavens themselves. The initial clock humanity ever mastered reading, a location where early watchers gauged time not in hours, but in recurrences, in configurations, and in the gradual, inexorable cadences of Earth. Because it was there that the earliest grasp of cycles originated, and it is there that the profounder tale of ascent, breakdown, and oblivion genuinely commences. Long before stone metropolises ascended from river shores, and long before script anchored human recollection into clay and ink, the heavens were already marking time. Not time as hours and minutes, but time as cadence and recurrence, as pattern and alert, as repetition extended over generations. Each day the sun ascended and descended. Each month the moon altered its appearance. Each year shadows adjusted their span and orientation across the terrain. These motions weren't faint, and they weren't haphazard. They recurred with a dependability that rendered them the first steady reference framework humanity ever met. For individuals existing near survival's brink, the heavens weren't backdrop. They were data. They indicated when inundations would arrive and when aridity would persist. They indicated when creatures would relocate and when flora would bloom. They indicated when warmth would prevail and when chill would reappear. Over time, these insights gathered not as disconnected details, but as organized wisdom conveyed through attentive observation and extended recollection. This is where the notion of the heavens as a clock starts to surface, not as analogy, but as purpose. A clock doesn't clarify why time elapses. It merely discloses that it does. Similarly, early sky observation didn't necessitate grasping physics or orbital dynamics. It necessitated focus. It necessitated endurance, and it necessitated acknowledging that specific configurations always preceded specific results. Throughout the ancient globe, edifices started to emerge that were evidently designed with this insight in view. Stone rings, whose apertures framed the dawn on one specific day annually. Sanctuaries whose passages filled with illumination only at solstice or equinox. Pyramids and terraces, oriented not toward peaks or streams, but toward stars that ascended and descended on foreseeable trajectories. These weren't ornamental selections. They were adjustments. When a community allocates immense effort and assets to align its most hallowed areas toward celestial occurrences, it is declaring what it cherishes and what it dreads. The heavens weren't remote. They were commanding. They regulated the cadences of existence below. In Mesopotamia, the earliest inscribed documents are replete not solely with financial dealings and regulations, but with precise notations of the firmament. Clay slabs documented the motions of planets and the scheduling of eclipses over centuries. These notations weren't maintained by solitary mystics, but by established priest astronomers whose duty was to counsel leaders on issues of timing and peril. So too soon, and the yield falters. Launch conflict under improper heavens and calamity ensues. Postpone building and the stream overflows before the barriers are finished. This wasn't superstition in the informal sense. It was pattern identification constructed on gathered experience. A community that endures sufficiently long starts to observe that the surroundings acts differently at varying times, and that those variances are frequently preceded by omens above. In Egypt, the yearly overflow of the Nile wasn't regarded as a shock, but as a planned occurrence connected to the helical ascent of particular stars. The reappearance of Sirius in the morning heavens signified the arrival of the waters with such dependability that it formed the foundation of their chronology. This wasn't speculation. It was association honed into certainty. Far over the sea in the Americas, the Maya crafted calendrical frameworks so elaborate that they monitored not just the solar year, but numerous overlapping cycles, including those of Venus and the Moon. Their engravings don't simply tally days. They encode connections between celestial cycles and terrestrial happenings. Certain intervals were deemed advantageous, others perilous. The disparity wasn't emblematic. It was functional. What clarifies when these cultures are examined collectively is that skywatching wasn't a solitary interest, but a common approach. Varied surroundings yielded varied emphases, but the fundamental principle stayed identical. The heavens were reliable enough to rely on and intricate enough to hold alerts. The profounder implication is disturbing. If early civilizations devoted so extensively to monitoring celestial cycles, then the risks must have been substantial. These frameworks weren't constructed to quench curiosity. They were constructed because something hinged on timing it correctly. This is where contemporary viewpoints frequently misconstrue the proof. When we meet ancient sky-aligned constructions, we incline to divide the scientific from the symbolic, as if the two couldn't coincide. Either these individuals were accurate watchers, or they were spiritual visionaries. In truth, those functions were indivisible. Significance and quantification strengthened each other because both were rooted in endurance. A deluge myth isn't a weather bulletin, but it isn't invention either. It is recollection molded to persist. It compresses experience into narrative so it can endure long after the initial watchers are departed. The sky clock performs the same in a distinct tongue. One employs tail. The other employs rock and shade. Across generations, wisdom like this grows susceptible. If circumstances stay steady long enough, the initial motives for alertness start to diminish. Calendars persist in use, but their immediacy lessens. Ceremonies endure, but their intent turns symbolic rather than tactical. What was once readiness becomes custom. What was once alert becomes right. And then the heavens continue shifting. The cycles don't halt because they've been overlooked. The earth doesn't halt because its cadences are no longer grasped. It persists in its extended motion through space, outlining arcs and angles that stay indifferent to conviction. When circumstances alter once more, the old indicators may no longer be observed, and the old wisdom may no longer be accessible in a form that can be utilized. This is how a clock can maintain flawless time while nobody is attending. The notion that early civilizations aligned themselves around the heavens doesn't demand they knew everything. They didn't need to grasp axial precession or orbital eccentricity to acknowledge that patterns existed beyond one lifetime span. They needed only to notice that the heavens repeated, while the terrain below sometimes transformed disastrously. What we're left with today are pieces, configurations without directions, chronologies without context, myths without schedules. They seem remarkable, but disjointed. Yet, when seen through the prism of Earth cycles, they start to resemble the vestiges of an earlier interface between humanity and the planet it occupies. If the heavens were once a clock, then they were also an alert mechanism. And like any alert mechanism, it only functions if it is sustained and deciphered properly. When that deciphering fails, the clock doesn't shatter. The repercussions simply arrive unanticipated. The civilizations that succeeded may have inherited the edifices, but not the urgency. They may have committed the dates to memory, but forgotten the rationales. Over time, the heavens became lovely again instead of perilous, foreseeable again instead of menacing. That ease wouldn't endure eternally, because while daily and yearly cycles are simple to perceive, there are grander ones moving silently under them. Cycles that develop across centuries and millennia, and that don't declare themselves with evident signs. These profounder cadences don't disclose themselves in one lifetime. They demand memory longer than memory itself. And when those cycles alter, they don't inquire if anyone is still observing the heavens. They simply proceed. The long cold memory of the earth. There are patterns in the world that can't be discerned by observing the heavens for a season or even for a lifetime. They disclose themselves only when recollection extends beyond generations. When narratives last longer than metropolises, and when the terrain itself becomes the repository. These are the deep cycles of the earth, the ones that advance so gradually they seem permanent until abruptly they aren't. Long before the first sanctuary was aligned to a dawn, ice had already started its gradual advance and withdrawal across the planet. Immense layers of frozen water inched down from the poles, reforming continents, etching valleys, and sequestering oceans behind barriers of white. Then, just as slowly, they receded. Sea levels ascended, coastlines disappeared, fresh lands surfaced, forests supplanted tundra. The earth warmed, cooled, and warmed anew, not once, but recurrently. Current science terms these cadences Milankovitch cycles, named for the astronomer who first outlined how faint alterations in Earth's orbit and alignment modify the allocation of sunlight across the planet. The orbit itself gradually adjusts in form, cycling from nearly circular to mildly elongated over about 100,000 years, altering how uniformly solar energy is obtained. Simultaneously, the tilt of the Earth's axis fluctuates over roughly 41,000 years, modifying the contrast between seasons. Overlaid on both is a gradual wobble of the axis, a precession that finishes a full cycle approximately every 26,000 years, faintly changing the timing of seasons relative to Earth's location in space. None of these motions feel striking on human timescales. No single generation encounters them as events. Yet collectively they determine if summers are potent enough to dissolve accumulated ice or gentle enough to permit it to expand. If glaciers withdraw or advance, if vast areas incline toward plenty or shortage for thousands of years at once. These cycles function far beyond recorded history's scale, and yet their impacts are inscribed everywhere. They are sealed into ice cores extracted from Greenland and Antarctica, where stratum upon stratum of compacted snowfall conserves a chemical journal of the past. Minuscule air bubbles captured within that ice hold specimens of ancient atmospheres, enabling scientists to rebuild concentrations of carbon dioxide and methane extending back hundreds of thousands of years. Those records disclose repeated ascents and descents in temperature that align tightly with orbital cycles long before human industry arose. The memory is also inscribed into the oceans. In profound sea deposits lie the casings of microscopic creatures called foraminifera. These beings constructed their casings from seawater, incorporating oxygen isotopes in proportions that vary with temperature and ice volume. By interpreting those proportions, scientists can trace ancient ocean conditions across immense durations, affirming that warming and cooling adhered to persistent repeating patterns. The land, the sea, and the air all narrate the same tale. But geology and chemistry aren't the only locations where this memory endures. Across cultures divided by oceans and millennia, there is a notable recurrence of stories that speak of a chillier world, of an era when ice ruled the land, when survival demanded withdrawal, adjustment, or flight. These stories seldom depict ice sheets in scientific terms. Instead, they speak of ceaseless winters, sunless heavens, and territories forsaken to cold. They denote a before and an after, a divide between realms. Then arrive the deluges. As ice withdraws, it doesn't vanish silently. It liquefies. And when sufficient ice liquefies, oceans ascend. Shorelines submerge. Rivers alter paths. What was once inland becomes coastal. What was once coastal vanishes under the sea. This shift isn't abrupt in geological terms, but it is ruinous in human ones. If a civilization constructs its identity around a shoreline, the shoreline doesn't need to disappear instantly to ruin it. It only needs to recede beyond utility. Saline infiltration contaminates farmland. Ports become unreliable. Fresh water vanishes. Trade paths crumble. People depart. Knowledge splinters. Deluge myths surface repeatedly at precisely this divide. They are discovered in Mesopotamia, South Asia, the Americas, and further. Varied names, varied deities, varied champions, but the same essential memory persists. Water ascends. The old realm concludes. A lesser remnant endures. It is alluring to interpret these stories as emblematic ethical teachings, but symbolism doesn't account for their worldwide spread or their uniformity. What they resemble more is a collective reaction to a collective experience, reiterated at different times in different locales as ice ages concluded and sea levels surged. What renders this unsettling is the timing. The last major ice age ended around 12,000 years ago. That same interval signifies the onset of large-scale human civilization as we identify it today. Agriculture proliferates. Permanent habitations appear. Monumental building commences. Writing shortly ensues. It is as if humanity stepped into history just following a planetary reboot, entering a world that had only lately stabilized. This poses a question that is seldom asked outright. What existed prior to that reboot? During the last glacial maximum, sea levels were over 100 meters lower than today. Vast coastal plains that would have been perfect for early settlement now rest submerged beneath shallow seas. These areas are tough to investigate and even tougher to decipher, which makes them simple to overlook. But if earlier cultures resided along those drowned shorelines, their absence from the archaeological record would be anticipated, not dubious. Even inland, the transition was fierce. As climates altered, ecosystems rearranged themselves. Animals relocated or vanished. Familiar sustenance sources disappeared. Regions that had been livable for thousands of years became marginal or antagonistic. Knowledge tuned to old conditions forfeited its relevance nearly instantly. This is where the concept of guidance becomes vital. If a society acknowledged that long cold cycles existed even without grasping their exact mechanics, it might try to plan around them. It might construct in places less susceptible to flooding. It might safeguard knowledge in stone rather than ephemeral materials. It might encode memory into myth so it could endure displacement and loss. But acknowledgement doesn't assure survival. Milankovitch cycles don't function in isolation. They overlap with volcanic activity, alterations in ocean circulation, changes in atmospheric makeup, and occasional impacts from. Eventually the ocean shifts back. Fish return. Rains normalize. But the society that endured the disruption may no longer be the same. Population losses break continuity. Knowledge holders disappear. systems designed for a larger population become unsustainable. The cycle resets not only the environment, but the social structure built upon it. This is how the ocean remembers, not through permanence, but through recurrence. Each cycle erases some information and leaves behind fragments that future generations struggle to interpret. Over time, the connection between cause and effect fades. The sea becomes unpredictable again, not because it has changed, but because the memory of its patterns has been lost. When modern science identifies El Niño, it does not discover something new. It names something ancient. It gives language to a rhythm that has been shaping human survival since the first boats hugged coastlines and the first nets were cast into shifting waters. If lost civilizations were guided by Earth's cycles, then the ocean was one of the most unforgiving teachers. It rewarded attention and punished complacency. It offered abundance, but demanded respect. And when its rhythms were ignored or forgotten, the consequences arrived quietly, season by season, until collapse felt inevitable. The lesson embedded in these patterns is not that ancient people were helpless. It is that they were engaged in a constant negotiation with forces larger than themselves. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they did not. But the ocean never stopped keeping time, and it still has not. There is a boundary in the sky that cannot be seen, the wall of wind that holds winter back from the ground. A moving wall that encircles the planet and quietly decides who will feel the bite of winter and who will be spared. It is not made of stone or ice, and yet its presence has shaped history as surely as any mountain range or ocean current. When this wall holds, civilizations flourish. When it falters, the cold comes south, and with it collapse. Modern science calls this system the jet streams and the polar vortex. Fast-moving rivers of air that separate frozen polar regions from the more temperate zones below. Under stable conditions, these winds form a kind of atmospheric barrier, keeping the deepest cold locked near the poles. Most of the time, people live their entire lives unaware that this boundary exists at all. But ancient societies may have known it in a different way. Across the northern world, there are recurring legends of sudden winters, of years when cold arrived without warning and refused to leave, of lands once green that became uninhabitable within a generation. These stories do not describe gradual cooling. They describe intrusion, a force that crossed an invisible line and overwhelmed everything in its path. In later myth, this became the language of gods and monsters, of frozen realms breaking free, of walls breached and chaos spilling south. Yet beneath the symbolism lies a consistent observation. Winter does not always behave as expected. Sometimes it escapes its bounds. When the jet streams weaken or begin to wander, Arctic air can surge far beyond its usual domain. Regions adapted to seasonal cold suddenly face prolonged freezes. Crops fail. Livestock dies. Rivers freeze in unfamiliar ways. Trade routes collapse. A society that has no memory of such events has little chance to prepare for them. In the archaeological record, abrupt cooling events appear like scars. Tree rings narrow suddenly. Pollen records show rapid shifts in vegetation. Settlements contract or are abandoned altogether. These changes often occur without evidence of invasion or internal collapse. The land itself becomes hostile. One of the most striking examples occurred during the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions after the planet had already begun to warm. For more than 1,000 years, temperatures dropped sharply across the northern hemisphere. Ice advanced. Rainfall patterns shifted. Regions that had supported growing populations became marginal almost overnight. To people living through it, this would not have felt like a slow climate trend. It would have felt like betrayal. A return of winter when spring had already begun. If earlier civilizations existed during or shortly after such events, their memory of sudden cold would have carried enormous weight. The idea that winter was something that could break free would not be metaphorical. It would be historical experience. This may explain why northern myths often speak of a lost golden age, followed by an age of ice, of worlds separated by catastrophe rather than continuity. These are not abstract cosmologies. They are attempts to describe atmospheric behavior that does not fit everyday expectations. When the winds shift, they do not ask permission. Jet streams respond to temperature gradients across the planet. When those gradients change, whether through natural cycles or cascading effects from oceans and ice, the winds adjust, sometimes smoothly, sometimes violently. When they overcorrect, they begin to meander, looping far north and south instead of maintaining a stable path. For civilizations built on predictability, this is devastating. A single extreme winter can be survived. Repeated abnormal winters break systems. Storage runs out. Infrastructure fails. Social order frays. What makes this particularly dangerous is that once conditions return to normal, there is a tendency to forget. Memory shortens. The event is recorded as an anomaly rather than a pattern. Preparation fades. The wall of wind holds again, and life resumes as though nothing fundamental has changed. But the boundary remains dynamic. In myth, the idea of a northern force held back by an unseen barrier appears again and again. Whether described as a wall, a ring, or a cosmic boundary, the theme is consistent. There is something that keeps the cold contained, and if it fails, the world changes. This is not mystical thinking. It is experiential knowledge translated into story. If ancient civilizations were guided by Earth's cycles, then understanding the behavior of the winds would have been critical, not in the language of pressure gradients and Coriolis forces, but through lived patterns, certain alignments of seasons, certain years when preparation needed to be greater, certain signs that winter would not behave normally. Yet, like all long memory, this knowledge was fragile. A few generations of stable climate are enough to erode urgency. Skills are lost. Stories soften. What was once a warning becomes legend. When the winds shift again, the response is delayed and the consequences multiply. Civilizations rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. More often, they are worn down by repeated stress until they can no longer recover. A wandering wall of wind does not destroy cities directly. It undermines the conditions that allow them to exist. The cold does not conquer. It exhausts. And when it retreats once more, it leaves behind empty spaces where societies once stood, inviting future cultures to settle without understanding why those places were abandoned in the first place. The wall holds until it does not. Beneath every civilization, beneath every mountain range and ocean. When the earth lost its shield basin, there is a movement that no one can see, and yet no one escapes. It is slow, chaotic, and immensely powerful. Deep within the earth, molten iron flows in vast looping currents, and from that restless motion emerges an invisible shield that has protected life for hundreds of millions of years. Most of the time it is taken for granted. When it weakens, the consequences reach everywhere. The Earth's magnetic field is not a static feature. It is not a permanent barrier switched on at the birth of the planet. It is a dynamic system generated by motion and heat, by circulation in the liquid outer core that never truly settles. As long as that motion continues, the field exists. When it destabilizes, the shield falters. Modern measurements reveal just how unstable this system can be. The magnetic poles do not sit quietly at the top and bottom of the planet. They drift. Over the past century, the North Magnetic Pole has accelerated its movement dramatically, migrating hundreds of kilometers across the Arctic towards Siberia at a pace far faster than previously recorded. This is not a reversal, but it is a signal that the field is reorganizing itself in ways that are neither smooth nor predictable. At the same time, the strength of the field is not evenly distributed. One region in particular has drawn increasing attention over the South Atlantic, stretching from South America towards southern Africa. The magnetic field has thinned into a broad zone of weakness, now known as the South Atlantic anomaly. Here, the protective shield dips closer to the surface, allowing higher levels of radiation to penetrate the upper atmosphere. In the modern world, this anomaly is not theoretical. Satellites passing through it experience increased errors, electronic disruptions, and accelerated degradation. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station report heightened radiation exposure when crossing the region. These effects are small but measurable, reminders that the shield is not uniform and not permanent. Over long stretches of time, such weaknesses can deepen in the geological record. Periods of geomagnetic instability are marked by excursions, intervals when the field weakens to a fraction of its usual strength without fully reversing. During these times, the poles may wander far from their usual positions before eventually returning. To contemporary observers, these events are framed as distant risks unfolding over thousands of years. To ancient societies, the experience would have been immediate and visceral. When the magnetic field weakens, more charged particles from the sun and from deep space penetrate the upper atmosphere. Auroras spread far beyond their usual polar confines, lighting skies at latitudes where they had never been seen before. The night sky glows, flickers, and moves in unfamiliar ways. To people whose cosmology linked the heavens to earthly fate, such displays would not have been dismissed as harmless beauty. They would have been interpreted as signs that the order of the world was shifting. There is evidence that these periods coincided with environmental stress. Ice cores and sediment records show spikes in cosmogenic isotopes, signatures left behind when increased radiation reaches the planet during times of magnetic instability. Climate patterns appear to have shifted. In some regions, ecosystems collapsed rapidly, while in others they remained relatively stable. The effects were uneven, localized, and unpredictable, which made them all the more difficult to adapt to. From the perspective of human survival, uneven stress is often worse than uniform hardship. When neighboring regions experience different conditions, trade breaks down. Migration increases. Competition intensifies. Societies fracture under pressure, not because everyone is starving, but because some are starving while others are not. Ancient myths occasionally describe eras when the sky burned or when the sun behaved strangely. These accounts are often dismissed as metaphor. Yet in the context of a weakening magnetic field, they take on another dimension. A sky filled with widespread auroral activity would have appeared alive, volatile, and dangerous. It would have reinforced the sense that protection had been lost. The magnetic field does more than shape the sky. It also shields the atmosphere itself. Over long periods, a weakened field allows solar winds to erode upper layers of atmospheric gases. This process is slow, unfolding over centuries, but it contributes to climatic instability by altering how heat is retained and distributed. For civilizations already operating near the limits of environmental tolerance, even subtle changes could cascade into larger failures. What makes geomagnetic events particularly insidious is their subtlety. They do not arrive as singular catastrophes. They unfold gradually, blending into the background of other changes. One generation notices brighter skies. The next notices altered weather. The next notices declining harvests. By the time collapse becomes undeniable, the original cause has faded from memory. If ancient civilizations once tracked Earth's cycles, this would have been among the most difficult to understand and the easiest to mythologize. The core of the planet was inaccessible. The field itself was invisible. Only its effects could be observed indirectly through the behavior of the heavens. Knowledge of such a cycle, even in partial form, would have carried immense weight. It would have suggested that protection itself was temporary, that the planet periodically exposed its surface to forces from space. It would have reinforced the idea that civilization existed not under permanent guardianship, but under a conditional one. Yet, knowledge of danger does not guarantee resilience. A society might remember that the shield weakens from time to time without being able to act meaningfully on that information. Stone walls do not block radiation. Rituals do not restore magnetic fields. Preparation can mitigate some consequences, but others remain beyond control. This is where memory becomes a burden rather than a tool. To know that collapse has happened before, to know that the sky itself can turn hostile, is not the same as knowing how to prevent it. Over time, such knowledge may be softened, reframed, or buried beneath more comforting narratives. When stability returns, when auroras retreat and conditions normalize, the urgency fades. The shield feels permanent again. The cycle recedes into myth. But the Earth does not forget. Its core continues to churn. Its field continues to wander. And with each oscillation, it reminds us that protection is not guaranteed, only renewed for a time. If lost civilizations were guided by Earth's cycles, then moments when the planet lost its shield may have marked the boundaries between worlds, not with fire or flood alone, but with a quieter realization that the rules had changed and that survival required adaptation beyond what was possible. The collapse that follows such periods is rarely sudden. It is attritional, a slow unraveling driven by forces no one can see but everyone feels. The shield returns. Civilization rises again, and the memory of vulnerability fades, waiting for the next time the Earth decides to remind its inhabitants how thin that protection truly is. Of all the sun that reset civilizations, the forces that shape life on Earth, none feels as constant or as dependable as the sun. It rises every morning. It sets every evening. Crops grow under its light. Seasons follow its path across the sky. For most of human history, it appeared eternal, unchanging, a steady presence around which all other rhythms revolved. But the sun is not a fixed beacon. It pulses. Hidden beneath its blinding brightness is a cycle of activity that waxes and wanes over roughly 11 years. A rhythm driven by the twisting and reorganization of immense magnetic fields inside a star so vast that it could swallow the Earth more than 1,000,000 times over. During its quiet phase, the sun appears calm. During its active phase, it becomes volatile, releasing flares and occasionally hurling vast clouds of magnetized plasma outward into space in events known as coronal mass ejections. These coronal mass ejections, or CMEs, are not bursts of light, but massive expulsions of charged matter carrying billions of tons of solar material across the solar system at extreme speeds. When one of these eruptions is directed toward Earth, it collides with the planet's magnetic field, compressing it, shaking it, and forcing energy deep into the upper atmosphere. Modern instruments can track these events precisely. Ancient civilizations could not, yet they still lived with their consequences. Periods of heightened solar activity bring subtle but widespread effects to Earth. Radiation levels increase in the upper atmosphere. Electrical currents are induced in the ground. Atmospheric chemistry shifts. In extreme cases, powerful CMEs can disrupt the very systems that regulate climate patterns, nudging weather behavior away from its expected norms. To a society dependent on stable seasons, even small deviations could have outsized consequences. Planting too early or too late could mean famine. Livestock could suffer from unexpected heat or cold. Water supplies could fluctuate in ways that undermined entire regions. These failures would not appear to originate from the sun, yet the timing would not go unnoticed. What makes solar cycles particularly dangerous is not their magnitude, but their timing. They overlay other Earth cycles rather than replacing them. When heightened solar activity coincides with climatic stress driven by oceans, winds, or long orbital rhythms, the combined effect can push fragile systems past their breaking point. Solar maximums also increase the probability of extreme space weather events. A powerful CME striking a planet whose magnetic field is already weakened can amplify radiation exposure and atmospheric disruption. In the modern world, this raises fears about satellites, navigation systems, and power grids. In ancient worlds, the effects would have been experienced indirectly through failed harvests, altered animal behavior, disrupted navigation, and sudden environmental instability. Ancient cultures across the world elevated the sun to a central place in their cosmology, not simply as a giver of life, but as a regulator of order. Solar deities were often associated with judgment, renewal, and destruction as much as with growth. This duality reflects lived experience. The sun sustained life, but it also marked periods of danger. In some traditions, cycles of prosperity and collapse were linked to ages ruled by different solar aspects. These were not predictions in the modern sense. They were frameworks for understanding why the world sometimes seemed to turn against those who depended on it, even when human behavior had not obviously changed. There is growing evidence that solar cycles influence biological systems. Variations in radiation affect mutation rates, slightly alter atmospheric chemistry, and influence animal behavior. Migratory patterns shift. Breeding seasons adjust in a tightly coupled ecological network. These small changes ripple outward, sometimes destabilizing entire systems. For early civilizations, these ripples would have been interpreted as omens, not because they lacked rationality, but because they lacked a separate category for phenomena that crossed the boundary between sky and life. When harvests failed and disease spread during periods of unusual solar activity, the connection would have felt direct and immediate. What is striking is how often major periods of social upheaval coincide not with single disasters, but with clusters of environmental stressors. Collapse is rarely triggered by one event alone. It is triggered by convergence. The sun plays a critical role in these convergences. It is the external driver that can amplify internal instability. When solar activity intensifies at the wrong moment, it does not need to destroy infrastructure directly. It only needs to push already strained systems beyond their limits. This may help explain why some civilizations appear to reset rather than simply decline. Archaeological layers show periods of abandonment, followed by reoccupation. Cultural continuity breaks, then resumes in altered form. Knowledge is lost, then rediscovered. The sun did not end these societies by itself. It synchronized with other forces that did. Over time, such experiences shaped collective memory. The sun came to represent both continuity and renewal, a symbol of cycles larger than human ambition. Worship was not submission, it was acknowledgement. If Earth's cycles once guided lost civilizations, then solar rhythms would have been among the most difficult to anticipate and the hardest to resist. They were predictable only in hindsight. Their impacts were diffuse rather than dramatic. They tested resilience rather than strength. In the modern world, we often speak of resilience as a technical problem. In the ancient world, it was a philosophical one. How do you build a society around a force that gives life yet periodically destabilizes the conditions that society depends upon? The answer again and again was to encode memory into culture, to remind each generation that prosperity was conditional, that renewal followed disruption, that collapse was not failure, but transition. The sun rises after every dark age, but it does not guarantee what kind of world it will illuminate. If the sun governed the moon and the rising waters, the long breath of life, then the moon ruled its pulse. It moved closer, farther, brighter, darker, drawing the oceans into motion with a force that was gentle in appearance, but absolute in effect. No civilization that lived near water could ignore it. The tides arrived whether they were expected or not, reshaping coastlines twice each day, reminding humanity that even solid ground was negotiable. To ancient observers, the moon was not mysterious because it was unpredictable. What happens when a civilization understands that the sea operates in cycles but cannot influence them? It plans where it can. It diversifies food sources. It builds storage. It develops trade. But when multiple bad years arrive in succession, even the best preparation begins to fail. Archaeology shows this again and again. Infrastructure grows more complex just before collapse. Granaries expand. Canals multiply. Defensive walls rise. These are signs of adaptation, not decadence. They suggest society is responding to increasing stress, not ignoring it. It was mysterious because it was precise. Its phases returned with unwavering regularity. Its influence could be tested and confirmed. Fish appeared in certain patterns. Shorelines exposed themselves and then disappeared. Boats moved more easily at some times than others. Over generations, these observations accumulated into knowledge that was practical rather than poetic. But beneath the familiar rhythm of daily tides, there was a deeper motion, one that unfolded slowly enough to escape immediate notice. Roughly every 18.5 years, the orientation of the moon's orbit slowly shifts, altering how its gravitational pull aligns with the Earth and the Sun. This subtle realignment changes the balance that governs tidal extremes. When the cycle reaches its peak, high tides rise higher than usual and low tides fall lower. On their own, these changes are manageable. Combined with storms and elevated sea levels, they become destructive. Modern science refers to this long rhythm as the lunar nodal cycle. Ancient societies did not name it, but they lived inside it. Coastal settlements across the world reveal a pattern of repeated disruption that aligns with this hidden pulse. Harbors slowly silted up. Salt water intruded into farmland. Low-lying structures were rebuilt again and again, or abandoned altogether. In some regions, entire communities retreated inland, only to return generations later when conditions stabilized. These movements were not random. They followed the rhythm of the water, even when the people experiencing them did not consciously recognize the cycle behind it. Flood stories appear with striking consistency across the ancient world. A great inundation, a warning ignored, a remnant saved. These stories are often treated as moral allegories, but they align closely with periods when rising seas and amplified tidal extremes would have combined to overwhelm early coastal societies. The moon does not flood the world in a single moment. It increases the probability of flooding at regular intervals, quietly stacking the odds. What makes lunar-driven flooding especially dangerous is its predictability without immediacy. A civilization may experience a catastrophic flood once or twice within living memory. By the time the next extreme arrives, the knowledge of the previous one may exist only as story, stripped of urgency and practical detail. Preparation fades. Vulnerable areas are resettled. The same mistakes are repeated. The moon's influence does not act alone. As ice ages end and global temperatures rise, sea levels climb, shifting the baseline upward. Floods that were once rare become frequent. High tides reach farther inland. Storm surges ride on top of already elevated waters. The lunar cycle itself does not change, but its impact intensifies as background conditions evolve. Ancient engineering sometimes reflects an awareness of this danger. Raised platforms, artificial mounds, cities designed with elevated ceremonial centers and lower peripheral zones. These were not purely symbolic choices. They were adaptations to a world where water could claim territory without warning. Yet adaptation has limits. As populations grow, pressure to occupy fertile coastal land increases. Trade concentrates wealth and power near ports. Political centers gravitate toward the sea. Over time, risk is normalized. Flooding becomes an inconvenience rather than a warning. When the next extreme arrives, it is no longer survivable. In myth, this becomes a story of hubris. In reality, it is a story of forgetting. If Earth's cycles once guided civilizations, the moon would have been one of the clearest teachers. It demonstrated that stability was conditional and that boundaries shifted over time. It taught that the line between land and sea was not fixed, only temporarily agreed upon. The collapse that follows rising waters is rarely dramatic in the way stories suggest. It is incremental. Infrastructure degrades. Disease spreads in stagnant water. Agriculture fails as soils turn saline. Economies contract. People leave. What remains is interpreted later as abandonment rather than retreat. Centuries pass. Waters recede. The land becomes habitable again. New settlers arrive with no memory of why the old ones left. Ruins lessons are reused. Myths are retold without context. The cycle completes itself. Today, scientists recognize that the same lunar cycle continues, and that its next peak aligns with a period when global sea levels are already elevated. Projections suggest that during the middle of the 2030s, tidal extremes and flood risk are likely to increase in many coastal regions, not because the moon has changed, but because the world beneath it has. The moon continues its quiet revolution, indifferent to who builds and who abandons. If there is a warning embedded in these patterns, it is not that flooding will destroy civilization outright. It is that civilizations repeatedly choose to believe that the last flood was the last one that mattered. The moon has never made that promise. By the time a civilization realizes it is in trouble, the reset. When knowledge failed, the forces acting upon it have usually been at work for generations. Collapse rarely arrives as a single moment that can be pointed to and named. It unfolds as a slow compression of options and narrowing of futures until what once felt like choice becomes necessity, and what once felt permanent becomes fragile. This is the paradox that sits at the center of forgotten worlds. If ancient civilizations truly understood Earth's cycles even partially, then why did they still fall? Why did knowledge not save them? The answer lies in the nature of the cycles themselves. None of the rhythms that govern the planet operate alone. Orbital changes overlap with ocean pulses. Atmospheric boundaries shift while solar activity rises. Sea levels climb as tidal extremes intensify. Magnetic fields weaken during periods of climatic stress. Each cycle on its own may be survivable. Together they compound. A society might recognize a flood cycle and prepare for water. It might recognize colder winters and store grain. It might recognize drought and build irrigation. But when multiple stresses arrive at once, the systems designed to manage them begin to interfere with one another. Resources are diverted. Priorities conflict. Decisions that solve one problem worsen another. This is when knowledge begins to fracture. Record-keeping fails first. Archives are neglected or destroyed during migration and conflict. Specialists disappear. Oral traditions lose precision as trauma compresses memory into symbolism. What was once practical guidance becomes mythic reference. What was once exact timing becomes a general warning that something bad happened long ago. Archaeology preserves this moment imperfectly. Layers show sudden declines in population. Construction halts mid-project. Tools remain where they were last used. In some regions, technological sophistication regresses. In others, it vanishes entirely. These are not signs of ignorance. They are signs of interruption. When systems collapse, they do not take all knowledge with them. They take continuity. A child born after collapse inherits fragments without context, a calendar without climate, a myth without measurement, an alignment without explanation. The cycle continues to move, but the interface that once connected human action to planetary rhythm is broken. This may explain why so many ancient sites feel simultaneously advanced and incomplete. They look like the remnants of something that understood more than it could preserve. Precision without instruction, complexity without explanation. We see the result, but not the reasoning. The reset that follows is not a return to zero. It is a reorganization around what remains. New societies emerge using whatever fragments survived the disruption. They adapt to the new conditions rather than the old ones. They build stories that make sense of the ruins around them. Over time, those stories become origin myths rather than warnings. From within the new world, the collapse of the old one appears total. From the perspective of deep time, it is transitional. What is lost in this process is not only infrastructure or population, but perspective. The memory that Earth operates on scales larger than civilization fades. The urgency that once drove careful observation dissolves. Stability is assumed again because it is all that has been experienced. This is the most dangerous phase of the cycle. A civilization that knows it is temporary behaves differently from one that believes it is permanent. The first plans for disruption. The second plans for expansion. Over time, expansion increases vulnerability. Systems become optimized rather than resilient. Margins shrink. Redundancy is removed. When the next convergence of cycles arrives, the response is slower and less coordinated than before. Knowledge exists, but it is fragmented across institutions that no longer communicate. Warnings are debated rather than acted upon. Preparation is postponed because consequences feel abstract. This is how knowledge fails, not because it was wrong, but because it arrived without authority. In ancient worlds, authority came from memory, from the weight of experience passed down through generations. When that chain was broken, expertise lost its power. Decisions were made without reference to long cycles, because long cycles were no longer part of lived reality. The reset completes itself when enough time passes that the collapse is no longer remembered as collapse. It becomes prehistory. Ruins are attributed to legend. Discontinuities are smoothed over. Humanity tells itself a new beginning has occurred. But the Earth does not recognize beginnings. Its cycles continue uninterrupted, indifferent to which societies understand them and which do not. Each reset clears the surface while leaving the deeper rhythms untouched. If lost civilizations were guided by Earth's cycles, then their failure does not disprove the value of that knowledge. It demonstrates its fragility. Understanding must be maintained continuously, or it degrades. Memory must be renewed, or it fades. Awareness must be lived, or it becomes symbolic. The reset is not punishment. It is consequence, and it is not finished. There is a temptation at the end of every long story to believe that it has. Are we repeating the same mistake been leading toward us all along? That the present moment is the culmination rather than another passage. Modern civilization is especially vulnerable to this illusion. We measure progress in decades, innovation in years, and success in quarters. Against that scale, the Earth appears slow, passive, and forgiving. But when viewed through the lens of deep time, our moment looks less like an ending and more like a familiar phase. We now understand more about Earth's cycles than any civilization before us. We can measure the wobble of the planet's axis to fractions of a degree. We can track ocean temperatures across the entire globe in real time. We can observe solar storms as they erupt and calculate their arrival at Earth days in advance. We can detect changes in the magnetic field unfolding deep beneath our feet. And yet, knowledge alone has never been the deciding factor. The civilizations that came before us were not ignorant of change. They experienced it directly. They built cultures around it. They encoded it into stone and story. Their failure was not that they misunderstood the planet, but that they could not outlast the convergence of forces acting upon them. The uncomfortable parallel is this. We recognize the cycles, but we no longer organize our lives around them. Our systems assume continuity. Our infrastructure assumes stability. Our economies assume growth. When cycles are acknowledged, they are often treated as background variables rather than governing forces. We debate them. We model them. We argue over responsibility, but we rarely restructure society to accommodate them. The result is a familiar pattern. Rising seas meet coastal megacities. Shifting atmospheric currents collide with globalized agriculture. Solar activity intersects with a civilization dependent on fragile technological networks. Magnetic weakening coincides with unprecedented reliance on satellites and electricity. Each issue is discussed in isolation while the deeper convergence remains largely unaddressed. This is not because the information is unavailable. It is because acting on long cycles requires decisions that are uncomfortable in the short term. It requires restraint rather than expansion, preparation rather than optimization, memory rather than confidence. Ancient civilizations often collapse not at the first sign of change, but after prolonged periods of denial. Conditions worsened slowly enough to be rationalized. Adaptations were delayed. Warnings were reframed as exaggerations. By the time decisive action became unavoidable, options had narrowed. We recognize this pattern because we are living inside it. Climate change today is often framed as a single phenomenon, but it is better understood as an amplifier. It accelerates processes that already exist. It sharpens extremes that were once rare. It compresses timelines that once unfolded over centuries into decades. In this sense, humanity has become a new variable in Earth's cycles, not replacing them, but interacting with them in unpredictable ways. The planet's rhythms did not stop when industry began. They continued. What changed was the speed at which pressures accumulated. This places modern civilization in a position unlike any before it. We are aware of the cycles and aware of our influence, yet still constrained by systems designed for a more stable world. We are both informed and unprepared. The forgotten worlds of the past offer no simple warning and no guaranteed lesson. They show us that understanding does not equal control, and that survival depends as much on humility as on knowledge. They remind us that civilizations rise during favorable alignments and struggle when those alignments dissolve. The question is not whether Earth's cycles will continue. They will. The question is whether we will continue to treat the current moment as permanent or recognize it as transitional. Whether we will act as participants in a larger system or as its final authority. Whether we will preserve memory in forms that can endure disruption or allow it to fragment once again. If ancient civilizations once guided themselves by Earth's cycles, then their collapse was not the result of superstition. It was the result of limits. Limits of coordination, limits of scale, limits of time. We have extended those limits, but we have not escaped them. History suggests that the most dangerous belief a civilization can hold is that it has moved beyond history itself, that the rules no longer apply, that the cycles have been mastered rather than merely observed. The Earth has never made that promise. It has only offered windows of stability between phases of change, windows long enough for societies to flourish and short enough to remind them that flourishing is conditional. Whether we are approaching the edge of such a window or simply standing within it remains uncertain. What is clear is that the cycles are still turning quietly and relentlessly as they always have. And long after our debates fade and our structures erode, the planet will continue to move through its rhythms, carrying forward the memory of every world that rose, believing it was the exception. If this story resonated with you, even quietly, you can support this channel in simple ways. A like helps the story travel a little further. Sharing it passes the question on to someone else. And if you choose to subscribe, you'll be here when the next forgotten world is explored. Thank you for listening and for taking this journey with us. The only question left is whether we will become another forgotten world, or whether remembering the cycles this time will finally change the ending. Space. A civilization that grasps the cadence may still be overrun when multiple forces merge. Knowledge can purchase time. It can't always avert breakdown. This may clarify why so much ancient memory feels fragmented, why knowledge surfaces early, then vanishes, why advanced comprehension seems to emerge suddenly and then withdraw, leaving only echoes. Each breakdown erases not only metropolises, but continuity. Survivors reconstruct with less data than their forebears held. Over generations, the deeper context diminishes. The Earth remembers even when we don't. Ice returns, ice withdraws, seas ascend, seas stabilize. The cycle persists whether or not anyone remains who recalls what the last shift resembled. From this viewpoint, ancient monuments aligned to the heavens acquire a fresh aspect. They aren't merely markers of daily and yearly cycles, but acts of resistance against oblivion, efforts to root memory into something more lasting than spoken tradition. Stone doesn't recall why it was positioned where it was. but it endures long enough for someone else to pose the question anew. If Earth's long, cold memory once directed civilizations, then it did so imperfectly. Enough to inspire readiness, not enough to guarantee endurance. And when breakdown arrived, it likely didn't feel like knowledge's failure, but its depletion, a recognition that grasping a cycle doesn't confer mastery over it. What endures today is a world that seems stable only because we've existed within one favorable stage. We regard ice ages as remote curiosities and deluges as ancient legends. Yet the forces that generated them haven't ceased. They've only shifted beyond everyday perception's range. The peril lies not in the cycles themselves, but in confusing their present quiet for permanence. Because the Earth hasn't finished recalling its colder selves. If the heavens were the first clock, then the ocean that remembered was the first repository, not because it records events tidily, but because it absorbs alteration and discharges it on its own terms. Long after ice withdraws and continents settle, the sea persists in circulating heat around the planet, storing memory in currents that journey thousands of kilometers and return years later, modified but recognizable. To ancient coastal communities, the ocean was never impartial. It was bountiful one decade and ruinous the next. Fish arrived in profusion and then disappeared without alert. Rains adhered to expected seasons until suddenly they didn't. Storms adjusted their trajectories. Coastlines that had seemed stable for generations became unforeseeable. These alterations weren't haphazard, even if they felt that way to those enduring them. Today we describe one of the most forceful expressions of this conduct as the El Niño Southern Oscillation. A gradual pulse between ocean and atmosphere that recurs every few years. Warm water accumulates where it shouldn't. Trade winds diminish or intensify. Rain relocates from one continent to another. Regions relying on seasonal equilibrium are hurled into extremes of inundation or aridity. But this phenomenon didn't commence when it was named. It has molded human history far longer than it has molded scientific frameworks. Along the Pacific coasts of the Americas and Asia, entire communities oriented their lives around the dependability of marine ecosystems. Fisheries prospered when cold, nutrient-rich water ascended from the depths. Crops flourished when rainfall followed familiar paths. When that system stumbled, the repercussions cascaded outward. Fish vanished first, then food deficits ensued, then social tension emerged. In the Andes, archaeological strata reveal repeated disruptions in settlement patterns. Periods of growth are followed by desertion. Irrigation frameworks are constructed and then abandoned. These shifts align not with abrupt invasions, but with climatic interruptions that would have rendered survival increasingly challenging. The ocean didn't assault. It simply altered. Across the Indian Ocean, similar patterns surface. Monsoon-reliant civilizations depended on the regular movement of warm and cool waters to maintain predictable winds and rainfall. When those systems destabilized, yields failed and trade routes crumbled. What had once been an interconnected maritime realm fragmented into isolated areas struggling to adapt. These disruptions weren't constant. They came and went. That is what made them perilous. A civilization can adjust to a harsh surroundings if it is consistently harsh. It can construct culture and technology around scarcity. What is far more difficult is adapting to instability. When plenty and breakdown alternate without warning, El Niño and its counterpart La Niña don't simply create bad years. They undermine anticipations. Myths from coastal cultures often depict the sea as a conscious force, not because people believed it had intent, but because its behavior followed cycles that felt purposeful. Years of generosity were followed by years of punishment. The pattern repeated often enough to be noticed, but not often enough to be easily predicted without long records. Some societies appear to have kept those records. Oral traditions describe years when the ocean turned warm and lifeless, when fish floated to the surface, when rains drowned villages far from shore while deserts cracked elsewhere. These aren't metaphors. They are descriptions filtered through memory. The danger of ocean cycles is not their intensity, but their reach. A change that begins in the Pacific can alter rainfall in Africa, trigger droughts in Australia, and shift storm tracks across North America. For a globalized world, this interconnectedness is obvious. For ancient societies, it would have felt like distant causes producing local devastation.